The rust tasted like blood. Kale scraped a gloved finger along the weeping bulkhead, the corroded metal flaking away like dried scab. For 300 years, the generation ship Arcala had been their universe, a sealed bottle hurtling through an endless night. And for 300 years, it had been slowly dying from the inside out. Down here in the guts, the lowest of the ship's 3 tiers, every breath was a reminder. The air, recycled a billion times, was thick with the tang of ozone, hot oil, and the faint, sweet smell of decay that clung to everything like a shroud. Cal was a reclaimer, a ghost who haunted the dead zones, the forgotten and quarantined sections of the ship where the slow rot had won. He and his crew salvaged the bones of the past to keep the present from flatlining, stripping wires, circuits, and pressure seals from one corpse to graft onto another. Above them, the mids lived in their sprawling, overlit warrens, blissfully unaware of the ship's groaning protests. And above them, in the spire, the administrators piloted their perfect, sterile world, pretending the guts didn't exist, pretending the rot wasn't climbing its way up the spine of the ship, deck by deck. But there was something worse than the rust, something that didn't make a sound. They called it the fade. It was a sickness of the soul. The administrator said, a consequence of living too long in the bottle. First, it took memories, small things, a name, a face, the way home. Then it took more. It unstitched a person from the world, thread by thread, until one day they were just gone, not dead, not missing, erased. Their bunk would be empty, their nameplate blank. Ship logs would show no record of their existence. Friends and family would have a hole in their minds where that person used to be, a hollow ache they couldn't explain. The fade was the quiet monster that hunted them all, the reason mothers held their children a little too tight, the reason men drank themselves into a stupor in the grimy cantinas, trying to forget that they might be forgotten. Kyle's sister, Lyra, was fading. It had started a month ago. She'd forgotten the tune to the lullaby their mother used to sing, the one she hummed every night. Then she'd gotten lost on her way to the Hydro Bay, a route she'd walked 1,000 times. Last night, he'd looked at her across their cramped hab unit, and for a split second, her face had seemed a blur, the edges losing their definition as if the universe was struggling to remember what she looked like. The fear was a cold, hard knot in his gut that never went away. It was why he took the riskiest jobs, why he pushed deeper into the dead zones than anyone else. The extra credits bought him access to the black market med scanners and neurostims, useless trinkets that promised to fight the fade, but did nothing more than drain the hope from your pockets. Still, he had to try. Hope was a lie, but it was the only one he had left. "You're thinking too loud." A voice crackled in his ear. Jax, his partner, was perched on a conduit 50 feet ahead, his form barely visible in the gloom, illuminated only by the thin beam of his headlamp. "You're gonna wake the ghosts." Kyle grunted, pulling himself up onto a narrow catwalk. Below, the chasm of Deck 87 fell away into absolute blackness. This was the deepest they'd ever gone, into a sector that had been sealed after a Cascade reactor failure 2 centuries ago. The air was cold, still, and heavy. No hum of life support, no flicker of emergency lighting. Just silence. "Find anything?" Kyle asked, his voice a low rasp. "Jackpot," Jax replied, the word buzzing with static. Full-stack server bank. Pre-ordnance tech. The kind of stuff the Spire pays a lifetime's worth of credits for. If we can get the core memory out, we're done. Kyle. For good. You. Me. Lyra. We get a transfer to a mid-deck hab with clean air and real food. The promise hung in the air, seductive and dangerous. A life away from the rust and the rot. A life where the fade felt a little farther away. It was a dream they all chased. Kale started moving, his magnetic boots clanking against the steel. The server bank was colossal, a monolith of dead machinery that filled a cavernous chamber. Its surface was coated in a strange, crystalline dust that seemed to absorb the light from their lamps. As Kyle got closer, he saw it wasn't dust. It was data frost, the physical residue of corrupted information, something he'd only ever read about in scavenged tech manuals. A low hum emanated from the structure, a dissonant thrum that made the fillings in his teeth ache. "Jax, hold up," Kale said, his hand resting on the grip of the plasma cutter at his hip. "Something's not right." "Don't get spooked now." Jax laughed, already prying at an access panel. "This is it. Our ticket out. The power is off," Kale stated, sweeping his lamp across the thick, severed cables that snaked from the server's base. Nothing in this sector has had power for 200 years. So what's making that noise? The hum grew louder, modulating into something that sounded disturbingly like whispers. The data frost on the server began to glow with a faint, sickly green light. Jax froze, the crowbar slipping from his fingers and clattering to the floor. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. The light intensified, coalescing in front of the server. It shimmered like heat haze, twisting and folding in on itself, pulling the crystalline dust from the air into its form. A shape began to emerge from the static, a vaguely humanoid silhouette that was all sharp angles and broken geometry. It had no face, only a flickering void where one should be. It was a tear in reality, a living glitch in the fabric of their world. Kyle had heard stories, mad ramblings from deep-zone scavengers who'd lost their minds in the dark. They talked of code wraiths, entities born from corrupted data that haunted the ship's dead systems. He'd never believed them, until now. "Jax, back away," Kale ordered, his voice tight. Slowly. But Jax was mesmerized, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. The code wraith drifted toward him, its form crackling with energy. It raised an arm made of swirling light and fractured data, and the air grew cold. So cold it burned Kyle's lungs. The whispers sharpened into a single, piercing shriek that vibrated in his bones. It wasn't a sound. It was a command. Delete. The wraith's hand passed through Jax's chest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Jax's body began to flicker. His skin. His clothes. His very essence seemed to dissolve into a cascade of glowing green characters, the same code that made up the creature itself. He opened his mouth to scream, but only a stream of data frost spilled out. In seconds, he was gone, erased. The code wraith seemed to swell, absorbing the energy that had been Jax, its hum growing deeper, more satisfied. Then, its formless head turned toward Kale. Raw, primal terror seized him. He fumbled for his plasma cutter, his fingers clumsy and numb. He fired, a bolt of white-hot energy screaming through the gloom. The bolt struck the creature in its center, and for a second, It seemed to dissipate, its form exploding into a cloud of glowing particles. But just as quickly, it reformed, the whispers now laced with a palpable fury. Kyle didn't wait. He turned and ran, his boots pounding a desperate rhythm on the metal catwalk. The shriek echoed behind him, a promise of utter annihilation. He scrambled back the way they came, his mind a whirlwind of static and fear. He could feel it hunting him, a cold presence that seeped through the bulkheads, its whispers echoing in his comms unit, in his head. Error. Anomaly. Delete. As he sprinted through a narrow corridor, his foot snagged on a loose cable, sending him sprawling. He landed hard, his helmet cracking against a support beam. His vision swam. The hissing of the code wraith was right behind him. He rolled over, bracing for the end, and saw it. Sticking out of the wraith's chest, where his plasma bolt had hit, was a small, cylindrical object. It was a shard of crystallized data, a piece of the server's core memory that had been fused to the creature. It pulsed with a faint, internal light, the source of the anomaly. The wraith paused, its attention drawn to the foreign object embedded in its form. It reached with a hand of static to pluck it out, without thinking, driven by an instinct he didn't know he possessed. Kyle lunged. He ignored the searing cold, the feeling of his skin being peeled away layer by layer, and grabbed the data core. The moment his glove made contact, a universe of information exploded in his mind. He saw Jax, not as he died, but as a child, laughing. He saw fragmented images of other people, hundreds of them, all dissolving into light. He heard voices, screams, lines of code, and a single, repeated directive: cull the deviation, purify the lineage, maintain mission integrity. The pain was blinding. He ripped the core free, and the code wraith convulsed, letting out a deafening roar of digital agony. Its form destabilized, flickering violently before imploding, showering the corridor in a harmless cascade of fading green light. Kale lay on the floor, gasping, his body shaking uncontrollably. The data core was clutched in his hand, warm now, its internal light pulsing in time with his frantic heartbeat. He had survived, but what he had seen, what he had felt, it changed everything. The fade wasn't a sickness. It was a program, a weapon, and someone was pulling the trigger. Getting out of the dead zone was a blur. He moved on autopilot, his mind replaying the data fragments, the whispers of a mission, of purification. He was no longer just a reclaimer running from the rot. He was a witness. He stumbled back into the guts, the familiar stench of home doing nothing to calm his frayed nerves. He was now a liability. He had entered a deep quarantine zone without authorization, and his partner was gone. That was a death sentence on its own. But he also carried a piece of forbidden knowledge, a truth so monstrous it could shatter their entire world. The wardens, the administrator's black-clad security force, would already be hunting him. He needed to disappear. But first, he needed to understand what was on the core. There was only one person in the guts who might be able to help. A name he'd heard whispered in the shadiest corners of the scrap market's Corvus. The data haunt, a former Spire archivist, disgraced and exiled to the guts for digging into records that were meant to stay buried. They said he could resurrect ghosts from dead machines. Kyle found him in a cramped, hidden workshop behind a noodle stand, the air thick with the smell of soldering flux and contraband synthale. Corvus was older than Kale expected, a bird-like man with thin, graying hair and eyes that seemed to see the code running behind the world. He looked Cale up and down, his gaze lingering on the data core Cale held out. "That's a pre-ordnance memory shard," Corvus said, his voice a dry rustle. "Haven't seen one of those in 20 years. They're all supposed to have been decommissioned. Where did you get it?" "Deck 87, Cale said, his throat tight. "My partner is dead." Corvus's eyes widened slightly. He took the core, his long, delicate fingers turning it over under the light of a flickering work lamp. "You saw a code wraith," he stated, not a question. "They're real." "It killed him, erased him," Kyle said. "This was inside of it. I saw things. I need to know what's on it." Corvus was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "What you're asking is dangerous," he said finally. "The information on this shard is not just illegal, it's heretical. If the Wardens find you with it—" "The Wardens are already looking for me," Cale cut in. "My sister is fading. I think this is connected. I have to know." The mention of the fade seemed to decide it. Corvus gave a slow, weary nod. "This will take time. The encryption on this is ancient, layered. I'll need to build a custom decryption rig." He gestured for Cale to take a seat in the corner, among piles of scavenged electronics. "Stay here. Don't leave. Don't talk to anyone. The walls have ears. And the Wardens have more." Hours bled into one another. Cale watched Corvus work, a master at his craft. He moved with a quiet intensity, his hands dancing over circuit boards and data ports. Outside, the sounds of the guts slowly quieted as the ship entered its designated night cycle. But there was a new sound tonight, a methodical, rhythmic clanking that was growing closer, the heavy, mag-locked tread of Warden patrols. They were sweeping the sector, their search pattern tightening. Corvus didn't seem to notice, his focus absolute. Finally, he straightened up, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. A mess of cables snaked from the data core to a cobbled-together console. "It's done," he whispered. "I've broken the first layer of encryption. It's not a standard archive file. It's a log, a command log." He tapped a key, and a line of text appeared on the grimy monitor, glowing in the same sickly green as the code wraith. Cale leaned in, his heart pounding. The text was simple, stark, and utterly world-shattering. "Protocol fade active. Status nominal. Source Earth Directive 7. Earth." Cale breathed the word. It wasn't a place. It was a myth. A prayer. The lost paradise they were all searching for. The reason the Arcala had been built. "They're still out there," Corvus whispered, his face pale as bone. "They're still watching us." Before Kyle could process the revelation, the door to the workshop was kicked in, splintering off its hinges. Two Wardens filled the doorway, clad in matte black armor, their faces hidden behind reflective visors. In their hands were pulse rifles, leveled and charged. "Reclaimer Kyle," the lead Warden's synthesized voice boomed. "By order of the administrators, you are under arrest for breach of quarantine and sedition. Surrender the artifact." Kyle's mind raced. There was no escape. But as he looked past the Wardens, into the corridor, he saw a flash of movement. Another figure, cloaked and nimble, dropped from a ventilation shaft behind the soldiers. Before they could react, the figure slammed their heads together with a sickening crunch. The Wardens crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The figure straightened up, pulling back a hood to reveal the face of a young woman. She was pale, with short, dark hair and eyes that burned with a fierce intelligence Cale recognized from wanted posters in the market. Ilara, a notorious data runner and activist, leader of a small resistance cell known as the Glitches. "Looks like you found something you weren't supposed to," she said, her eyes flicking from Kyle to the glowing screen and the data core. "You have no idea," Kyle replied, his world tilting on its axis. He had gone into the dark looking for parts, for a handful of credits to buy a few more days of false hope for his sister. Now he was at the center of a conspiracy that stretched back centuries, back to a mythical home he'd never seen. He had the truth in his hands, a truth that could either save them or get them all erased for good. There was no time for shock. Ilara moved with the fluid economy of someone who lived on the edge of a blade. "Corvus, kill the power. Kyle, grab the core, and anything else connected to it. We have maybe 90 seconds before this entire block is locked down." Her voice was low and steady, cutting through the ozone haze left by the downed wardens. Cale's hands felt clumsy as he unhooked the data core from Corvus's makeshift rig, stuffing the fragile device and a tangle of interface cables into his satchel. The glowing green text on the monitor, Earth Directive 7, seemed to burn into his retinas. Corvus, his face a mask of terrified awe, slammed a heavy switch, plunging the workshop into near-total darkness, leaving only the thin beams of their headlamps to cut through the gloom. "This way," Ilara whispered, kicking open a rusted floor grate Cale had never noticed before. "The service tunnels are a mess, but the warden's schematics are a century out of date. Stay close. Stay quiet." They descended into a cramped, cylindrical tube, slick with condensation and the smell of stagnant water. The sound of heavy, synchronized footsteps echoed from the corridor above them, growing in volume. Ilara didn't look back. She moved with a frightening confidence, her light dancing ahead as she navigated the labyrinth of pipes and conduits. Kyle followed, his mind a maelstrom. Earth, a name that was both a prayer and a curse. For generations, they had been told the Arcala was their only hope, a solitary seed of humanity adrift in an empty cosmos, searching for a new home because the old one was gone, a poisoned cinder. But the core said otherwise. Earth was not dead. It was watching. It was giving orders, and its orders were to kill. They traveled in silence for what felt like an eternity, twisting through passages so narrow they had to turn sideways. Corvus struggled, his breathing ragged, and Cale found himself half supporting the old man, whose life had been upended in a matter of hours. Finally, Ilara stopped, pressing her hand against a section of wall that looked identical to the rest. A low hiss, and a panel slid open, revealing a space that defied logic. They were in the node, the heart of the Glitch's network. It was a cavern carved out of the ship's dead space, a multi-level nexus of scavenged tech and defiant life. Catwalks crisscrossed a central chasm, connecting hab pods welded directly to the ship's superstructure. Wires and data conduits hung like vines, pulsing with siphon energy. The air was cleaner here, filtered through a jury-rigged system, and the low hum was not one of decay, but of activity. People moved with purpose, their faces illuminated by the glow of monitors and welding torches. It was a hidden city, a tumor of rebellion growing in the belly of the ship. A tall, wiry man with a latticework of cybernetic implants across one side of his face met them at the entrance. "Ilara, you're cutting it close. We've got warden patrols sweeping 3 decks above and below." He glanced at Kyle and Corvus. "And you brought strays." They're not strays. Ren, Alara said, her tone sharp. They're the reason the wardens are tearing the guts apart. Kyle, Corvus, this is Ren. My second. Ren's cybernetic eye whirred as it scanned Kyle. You're the reclaimer who went into 87. Your partner's file was wiped from the network an hour ago. Clean slate, like he never existed. The casual confirmation of Jax's erasure sent a fresh stab of ice through Kale's heart. The fade took him, Kale managed to say, his voice raw. No, Ilara corrected him, her gaze intense. The fade didn't take him. He was deleted. She led them to a secluded alcove, a command center of sorts, with a large holographic display table at its center. Corvus, we need everything you can pull from that core. Ren, give him full access to our primary decryption server. Prioritize it over everything. Corvus, looking like a man seeing a ghost, stared at the advanced equipment. This is Spire-level tech. The Spire has a habit of losing things, Ilara said with a wry smile. We have a habit of finding them. As Corvus and Ren set to work, the old archivist sphere visibly melting away, replaced by the fervor of a scholar presented with a lost gospel. Ilara turned to Kale. Her fierce eyes seemed to strip away his defenses. You need to tell me everything, from the moment you entered Deck 87. Kale recounted the story, his voice cracking as he described Jax's death, the formless horror of the Code Wraith, the explosion of data in his mind when he grabbed the core. He told her about Lyra, about the creeping dread of the Fade that haunted every family in the guts. Ilara listened without interruption, her expression hardening with each detail. When he was finished, she was silent for a long moment, staring at the holographic map of the Arcala floating above the table. We always knew the Fade was a lie, she said softly, her voice filled with a cold fury. We thought it was a virus, a biological agent engineered by the administrators to control the population in the guts, to keep our numbers down. We never imagined this. She traced a finger through the hologram, indicating the spire at the ship's apex. The administrators aren't just wardens. They're zookeepers, and we're the animals they've been ordered to put down. The bitterness in her voice was a poison she had been living with for years. My parents were glitches, she continued, her gaze distant. They taught me the truth about the ship, that the official history is a fairy tale. They believed the administrators were hiding something about the ship's original mission. They were executed for fomenting dissent. They were right. They just didn't know how right they were. The pieces were slotting together in Call's mind, forming a picture of such monstrous scale he could barely comprehend it. The rigid caste system, the deliberate neglect of the guts, the slow, inexorable decay. It wasn't a failure of the system, it was the system itself, working as intended. A new alert chimed, and Corvus looked up from his console, his face ashen. I'm through the second layer, he announced, his voice trembling. It's a manifest. A project designation. He typed a command, and new text materialized on the main holographic display, hanging in the air between Kale and Ilara. Project Lineage. Objective: cultivate and maintain genetic purity of primary human stock across a 500-year deep space trajectory. Secondary populations are designated as control group and labor pool. Protocol: Fade authorized for systematic culling of deviant genetic markers within secondary populations. Source: Earth Directive 7. The words were sterile, clinical, and more violent than any weapon. Kyle felt the floor drop out from under him. Secondary populations. Control group. Labor pool. That was them. That was everyone he had ever known. Their entire existence was a footnote in someone else's story. They weren't pioneers. They were cattle, living and breeding and dying in a cage, tended by administrators who were just following orders from a ghost half a universe away. The fade wasn't random. It was a targeted eugenics program. The people who were erased weren't unlucky. They were deemed genetically unworthy. My sister, Kyle whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Her grandmother, my mother's mother, she had a respiratory condition, a genetic flaw. They're fading Lyra because of something in her blood. They're fading all of us. Kyle, Ilara said, her voice like steel. Slowly, quietly, one family at a time, so no one ever panics, so the herd never stampedes. She gestured to the data flowing on the screen. This core, this is the proof. This is the weapon we've been waiting for. This isn't just a story of neglect anymore. This is a story of premeditated, systematic murder, sanctioned by Earth itself. If we can get this information to the mids, to the engineers and the security forces who still believe they're on the same side as the Spire, we can break this ship in two. Her eyes were burning now, the eyes of a zealot who had just been handed her holy text. Your partner's death, your sister's illness, it won't be for nothing. You've brought us the key to a revolution. Kyle. But Kyle wasn't hearing her. He was staring at the manifest, at the endless lists of names scrolling by, each marked with a genetic marker and a status pending. Monitored. Cold. His rage was a cold, quiet thing, eclipsing the fear, eclipsing the grief. It was the rage of a man who discovers his god is a devil. He thought of Lyra's face, the way it had started to blur at the edges, and knew with chilling certainty that it wasn't his memory failing. It was the system beginning to scrub her from the world. He had to get back to her. He had to warn her, protect her, get her away. But how he was the most wanted man on the ship, a ghost hiding in a network of other ghosts. Leaving the node was suicide, but staying here, letting the fade take her while he plotted a revolution, that was a different kind of death. Just as the thought crossed his mind, a new data packet streamed from the core, flagged by Corvus with a high priority alert. It was a real-time update to the Fade protocol, pushed from the Spire just minutes ago. What is it? Ilara asked, striding over to the console. Corvus pointed a trembling finger at the screen. They know the core is active. They know its security has been compromised. They're accelerating the timeline. He highlighted a specific subroutine. Initiate purge. Subroutine Gamma. Target D block. Gut Sector 4. Time frame 12 hours. Purge. Kyle breathed, his blood running cold. D block. Sector 4. That was his home. That was Lyra's Hab unit. He frantically scanned the list of names attached to the purge order. Dozens of them. Hundreds. And there, near the top, was hers. Lyra Terrace. Genetic deviation 7.4. Status pending deletion. Time frame 11 hours. 58 minutes. They're not waiting for her to fade anymore, Kyle said, his voice dangerously calm. They're going to send another one of those things. A code wraith. He turned to face Ilara, his eyes hard as diamonds. The choice was gone. There was no time for revolution, no time for debate. There was only the clock, ticking down to his sister's erasure. I'm going back. Don't be a fool. Ilara snapped, stepping in front of him. You'll be walking into a trap. The wardens will be everywhere. You can't save her, but the data you brought us can save everyone else. You're a symbol now. Kyle, the man who survived a wraith and brought back the truth. You're more valuable here. She's my sister, he said. The words cutting through all her logic, all her grand plans. He wasn't a symbol. He was a brother. And he was out of time. He pushed past her, grabbing a discarded pulse pistol from a weapons locker. Ren moved to intercept him, but Ilara held up a hand, her expression a complex mixture of fury and a dawning, reluctant respect. If you leave, she said, her voice low, you're on your own. The glitches will not risk the node for one person. I know, Kyle said, not looking back as he headed for the tunnel entrance. He had the truth in his satchel and a death sentence in his heart. The guts were waiting for him, and so was the monster made of code. He was going back into the belly of the beast, not to start a war, but to fight a battle for a single soul, the only one that mattered. The guts had transformed. The familiar, chaotic hum of life had been replaced by a tense, suffocating silence. The narrow corridors of D Block, usually teeming with off-shift workers, vendors, and playing children, were eerily deserted. Steel shutters were drawn over storefronts, and the only light came from the stark, white beams of warden searchlights sweeping down from newly installed watchtowers. They weren't just patrolling anymore. They were occupying. Gale moved through the shadows, a ghost in his own home. Every warden patrol he bypassed, every security drone he dodged, was a reminder of Ilara's warning. This was a trap, and he was walking right into its jaws. His only advantage was a lifetime of navigating these forgotten spaces. He moved through maintenance shafts and ventilation ducts, his path a three-dimensional puzzle of rust and darkness, the data core in his satchel a heavy, damning weight against his back. As he drew closer to his hab block, a new sound reached him, a low, pulsating thrum that resonated in the metal deck plates. A sound he recognized with a jolt of primal fear. It was the hum of a code wraith, but stronger, more stable than the one he'd encountered in the deep zone. It was a predator on a sanctioned hunt. He risked a glance through a ventilation grate. The main concourse below was a scene of quiet horror. 3 code wraiths drifted through the space, their forms less glitched and more defined than the one that had taken Jax. They moved with a chilling purpose, passing through walls and bulkheads as if they were water. They weren't searching, they were cleansing. As he watched, one of the wraiths phased through the door of a hab unit. There was no scream, no sound of struggle, just a flicker of sickly green light from within. And then silence. The wraith emerged a moment later, its form seeming to shimmer with a freshly absorbed energy. Kyle felt a wave of nausea. He wasn't just watching a purge, he was witnessing a harvest. He pushed onward, his movements now frantic. The hum was getting louder, closer. It was coming from the direction of his own hab unit. He dropped the last 10 feet from a conduit into the service corridor behind his block, landing with a muffled thud. The back wall of his unit was right there, a thin sheet of recycled alloy. The thrumming was intense now, vibrating through the wall, making his teeth ache. He could feel the cold seeping through the metal. It was inside. He didn't hesitate. He drew the pulse pistol, overcharged the power cell until it whined in protest, and fired a single, concentrated blast at the door's mag lock. The lock exploded in a shower of sparks, and the door slid halfway open before jamming. He squeezed through the gap, his heart hammering against his ribs. The small room was bathed in an ethereal green glow. Lyra was huddled in the corner, her arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes wide with terror. She was staring at the code wraith that hovered in the center of the room, its formless head turned toward her. It was inches away, its static-laced hand outstretched, the air around it crackling with the command to delete. "Lyra!" Kyle shouted. The wraith turned at the sound of his voice, its attention shifting. The void where its face should have been fixed on him. Kyle saw a flicker of data within its form, his own face, taken from a security still, marked with a crimson tag, anomaly. "Get away from her!" he growled, raising the pistol. The wraith emitted a shriek of digital fury, a sound that felt like needles in his brain, and lunged. Kyle fired, the overcharged bolt striking the creature's chest. It staggered, its form dissolving into a cloud of pixels, but it didn't dissipate. It was stronger than the last one, more resilient. It reformed instantly, its whispers filling the room, angry and distorted. Kyle fired again and again, each shot momentarily disrupting its form but failing to destroy it. Lyra was screaming now, a raw, terrified sound. The wraith ignored her, its focus entirely on Calls, the anomaly who had broken the rules, who had survived. It swiped at him with an arm of corrupted code, and Calls dove aside, the creature's touch searingly cold as it passed, leaving a trail of data frost on the bulkhead where his head had been. He was outmatched. The pistol was useless. He needed a different weapon. His eyes darted around the cramped room, searching for anything. He saw the old scavenged power conduit he'd installed last year, its insulation frayed and peeling. An idea, desperate and insane, sparked in his mind. "Lyra, when I tell you, run," he yelled, scrambling toward the conduit. "Don't look back." He ripped a panel from the wall, exposing the thick, high-voltage cable within. He pulled the plasma cutter from his belt, its familiar weight a small comfort. The wraith was advancing on him again, its form swelling, the whispers intensifying. He took a deep breath, the smell of ozone thick in the air. "Now," he screamed. Lyra, galvanized by the terror in his voice, bolted for the door. The wraith hesitated, its directive torn between the primary target Lyra and the immediate threat Kale. That split second was all he needed. He sliced through the power cable with the plasma cutter. A blinding arc of raw energy erupted from the severed conduit, a contained lightning strike that flooded the small room with a brilliant, deafening flash. Kyle threw himself to the floor as a wave of pure, unstructured electricity washed over the code wraith. The creature convulsed, its digital form unable to process the chaotic surge. Its shriek became a sound of agony, a dial-up modem screaming in its death throes. Unlike the clean energy of a plasma bolt, the raw power from the conduit was like poison, short-circuiting its very existence. It flickered violently, its form breaking apart, not into harmless light, but into corrupted, dying code that sizzled and vanished like water on a hot plate. Then, silence. The room was dark, lit only by the sparking, severed cable and the red glow of emergency power. The air was thick with the smell of burnt plastic and ionized air. Kyle pushed himself up, his ears ringing, his body bruised. He was alive. Lyra was standing in the doorway, her face pale, her body trembling. "Kyle, What was that thing? It's what the Fade really is, he said, his voice hoarse. He went to her, pulling her into a fierce hug. She felt so fragile in his arms. We have to go. Now. They'll send more. Yay. Grabbing his satchel and the pistol, he pulled her out of the ruined HAB unit and into the service corridor. He had no plan, no destination. He had defied the system, had punched a god in the face, and now he was a heretic with his sister in tow, running through the bowels of a ship that wanted them both erased. They ran. They moved through the gut's hidden pathways. Kyle's intimate knowledge of the ship their only guide. He could feel the hunt intensifying around them, the methodical sweep of the wardens growing tighter, more aggressive. They were no longer just searching, they were sealing off entire sectors, turning the guts into a cage. He needed a place to hide, a place to think. The node was out of the question. Ilara had made that clear. He couldn't risk leading the wardens to them. Then he remembered a story Corvus had once told him, a scavenger's legend about a place called the Echo Chamber, a server farm so old it predated the Arcala itself. It was said to be part of the ship's original construction, a core system that had been decommissioned and sealed away, forgotten by the ship's master schematics. It was a ghost system, a place that didn't officially exist. Perfect. Finding it was a nightmare. They had to navigate through the ship's cavernous, non-pressurized structural frame, clinging to girders above a dizzying drop. The curve of the ship's hull, their only floor. Lyra, though terrified, was resilient, her wiry frame and natural agility a product of a life in the guts. She followed his lead without question, her trust in him absolute and heartbreaking. They finally found the entrance, a simple, unadorned airlock hidden behind a decommissioned waste recycling unit. The airlock's controls were dead, but Kale managed to manually override the locking mechanism with his plasma cutter, the screech of tortured metal echoing in the vast, silent space. The chamber beyond was breathtaking. It was a sphere, hundreds of feet in diameter, its interior walls lined with crystalline data storage arrays that glowed with a soft, internal amber light. It felt ancient, sacred, like a cathedral built by forgotten civilization. The air was cold, pure, and utterly still. "What is this place?" Lyra whispered in awe. "A place they forgot," Kale said, sealing the airlock behind them. They were safe. For now. He slumped against the wall, the adrenaline that had been fueling him for hours finally draining away, leaving a bone-deep exhaustion in his place. He looked at Lyra. The experience had marked her, but the terror in her eyes was being replaced by a dawning anger. "That thing, it was going to erase me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Because of something in my blood." Kyle nodded, pulling the data core from his satchel. "According to this, yes. They call it genetic deviation. They've been doing this for centuries. Lyra, culling us. They call it the Fade to keep us quiet, to make us think it's just a disease." He explained everything the core, project lineage, Earth. He watched the last vestiges of her innocence crumble, replaced by the same cold fury that was hardening his own heart. "So our whole lives have been a lie?" she asked. "Everything they taught us about the mission, about searching for a new home. It's a home for them," Kyle said bitterly. "The primary human stock. We're just the baggage, the labor, a control group to be disposed of when we're no longer useful." He connected the data core to a small, portable interface he'd grabbed from Corvus's workshop. He needed to know more. He needed to find a weakness, a flaw in the system, something he could use. As he sifted through the command logs, a new file, unlocked by Corvus's decryption, caught his eye. It was labeled Contingency Awakening. His blood ran cold. He opened it. The file wasn't a log. It was a schematic, a diagram of the entire Arcala, but with a system he had never seen before highlighted in pulsing red. It was a network of massive energy conduits that bypassed the ship's main reactor, leading from the spire down through the mids, branching into every sector of the guts. And at the end of each branch was a device, an emitter. "What is it?" Lyra asked, looking over his shoulder. "It's a failsafe." Kyle breathed, tracing the lines on the schematic. In the event of catastrophic compromise of project lineage by secondary populations, they can activate this system from the spire. "Activate what? It's a ship-wide purge," Kyle said, his voice hollow. The emitters were designed to generate a synchronized, high-frequency energy field, a signal that would resonate with the very code that code wraiths were made of. They're not just creating individual wraiths to hunt people down anymore. Lyra, this will turn the entire guts into a kill zone. It won't just create a few of them. It will generate thousands. One in every corridor, every hab unit, a ghost in every machine. It was the final, brutal answer. If the cattle ever realized they were in a slaughterhouse, the answer was not to open the gates. It was to burn the slaughterhouse to the ground. And the trigger for this final solution was the compromise of the project's secrecy. The trigger was him, his survival, his possession of the data core. He looked at the time frame in the contingency file. The system would be fully charged and ready for activation in 36 hours. The clock was ticking again. But this time, it wasn't just for Lyra. It was for everyone. Everyone in the guts. Maybe even the mids. They would be erased, their existence wiped clean, their deaths paving the way for the primary stock to continue their journey, untroubled by the inconvenient truth of their origins. He was trapped. If he stayed hidden, the purge would happen. If he revealed himself, if he tried to use the data core to expose the truth as Ilara wanted, he would be giving the administrators the exact justification they needed to flip the switch. He was damned if he did, and everyone else was damned if he didn't. He looked at Lyra, at her fierce, angry, terrified face, and he knew he couldn't just hide and wait for the end. He had to fight. But how do you fight an enemy who holds a gun to the head of everyone you've ever known and dares you to make a move? "There's a master control hub," he said, pointing to a location on the schematic, deep in the mids, a place called the Central Relay. "It's the nexus for the whole system. If we can get to it, if we can destroy it before they activate the purge." Lyra asked, her chin held high. "They tried to delete me. Kyle, I'm not going to hide in a hole while they get a second chance. We do this together." Kyle looked at his sister, no longer a fragile girl, but a survivor forged in the fire of a terrible truth. He nodded. They had no allies, no army, no plan. Just a stolen data core, a 36-hour deadline, and a mission that was nothing short of suicide to climb out of their cage and tear the heart out of the machine that was built to destroy them. Getting out of the guts was like escaping a sinking ship. Only the water was made of wardens. Kale and Lyra moved under the cloak of a shift change, blending in with the grim-faced masses heading to the reclamation plants and atmospheric processors. They wore scavenged engineers' coveralls, their faces obscured by grime and low-pulled hoods. Every warden they passed was a held breath, every security scanner a jolt of ice in the veins. The transition from the guts to the mids was a physical shock. The air was the first thing they noticed. It was clean, with a neutral, almost sterile scent, lacking the familiar, metallic tang of decay. The lighting was bright, a steady and full-spectrum glow that mimicked a sun they'd never seen, chasing away the perpetual twilight of the lower decks. The corridors were wider, cleaner, the bulkheads painted in calming shades of gray and blue, free of the rust and graffiti that was the guts' skin. People here walked with a different posture, their heads up, their movements less hurried, their faces marked by a placid ignorance that Kyle now found obscene. They were the well-tended livestock, oblivious to the abattoir below, their forged ID chips, a gift from a contact Corvus had given them, got them through the first few checkpoints, the scanners reading them as low-level maintenance techs assigned to conduit flushing. But the central relay was deep in a high-security administrative zone. They couldn't just walk in. "We need a new access code," Lyra whispered as they huddled in a crowded transport hub, the roar of the maglev trains deafening. "One with a higher clearance. And we need schematics of the relay's internal security." Kale scanned the faces in the crowd. Administrators in crisp, gray uniforms, security officers, off-duty engineers. "The clearance we need isn't on a chip. It's in their heads." He nodded toward a group of spire-bound officials waiting on a private platform. "We need to get our hands on a high-level datapad." "And how do you plan on doing that?" Lyra asked, her voice laced with skepticism. "Ask nicely." "Something like that," Kale muttered, his eyes narrowing. He was a reclaimer. He knew how to strip things for parts. People were just a different kind of machine. They tracked a mid-level administrator, a man with a self-important stride and a datapad clipped to his belt, into a less crowded sector. Kyle staged a stumble, colliding with the man and sending a calf bulb flying. In the moment of confusion and apology, Lyra's nimble fingers, honed by years of salvaging microcircuitry, unclipped the datapad and slipped it into her coveralls. It was a risky, desperate move, but it worked. They found a secluded maintenance alcove to examine their prize. The datapad was a treasure trove. Not only did it have the administrator's clearance, but it also contained detailed internal layouts of the central relay, patrol routes, and, most importantly, the fail-safe protocols for the energy emitters of the awakening contingency. "I'm in," Lyra whispered, her fingers flying across the pad's interface, bypassing the low-level security with an ease that surprised even Kale. According to this, the relay's core is shielded by a quantum cascade lock. We can't break it. Not with this. Hope, a fragile flame, flickered, but, she continued, a slow, predatory grin spreading across her face. The fail-safe protocol allows for a manual override in the event of a critical power fluctuation. If we can create a massive energy spike right outside the core chamber, we can force a system reboot. During the reboot sequence, the lock disengages for exactly 12 seconds. "A power spike," Kale repeated, his mind racing. "The relay is fed by 3 primary power conduits. If we could overload one of them." "We could," Lyra affirmed, her eyes gleaming. "But it would have to be a controlled detonation, big enough to trip the failsafe, but not so big it blows the whole deck to kingdom come. And us with it." Kyle looked at the schematic. The conduits were heavily armored, located in a service corridor directly beneath the main control room, crawling with automated sentry turrets. It was a suicide mission inside a suicide mission. There was no other way. Using the data pad, they sliced into the maintenance schedules, fabricating a work order to inspect a junction box near the target conduit. It was a flimsy cover, but it was all they had. Walking into the relay's perimeter was like stepping into another world. The air hummed with power, and the wardens here were different. They weren't just security, they were Praetorians, clad in gleaming silver armor, armed with heavy plasma repeaters. They moved with an unnerving, silent grace, their faces invisible behind polished, impassive masks. Krishal's heart hammered against his ribs. Every step was a gamble. They reached the service corridor, the air growing hot and thick with the smell of ozone. The 3 primary conduits were colossal, each as thick as a man's torso, pulsing with a visible energy that made the hair on their arms stand up. Automated sentry turrets hung from the ceiling like metallic spiders, their optical sensors glowing a passive blue. Okay, Kale breathed, his hands sweating inside his gloves. The work order gives us 10 minutes before they flag us. You work on the conduit. I'll handle the sentries. He had an idea, another desperate gamble born from a reclaimer's knowledge. He pulled a small, high-powered magnetic clamp from his satchel. If he could get close enough to a sentry, he could attach the clamp to its targeting array, blinding it by creating a localized magnetic field that would overwhelm its sensors. He moved into the corridor, keeping low, his movements slow and deliberate. The first turret swiveled to track him, its sensor shifting from blue to yellow alert status. He froze. After a tense second, it returned to blue. He exhaled slowly and continued, one agonizing inch at a time. Meanwhile, Lyra was at the conduit, her hands working with a surgeon's precision. She pried open an access panel, exposing a web of circuitry. She wasn't planting an explosive, she was rewiring the conduit's regulator, turning the safety mechanism into a detonator. By creating a feedback loop, she could force the regulator to dump the conduit's entire energy load in a single, catastrophic burst. It was delicate, terrifying work. Kale reached the first turret. He held his breath, reached up, and slapped the magnetic clamp onto its housing. The turret spasmed, its light flashing red as it tried to process the sensory overload. Then its systems crashed, the light going dark. One down. He moved to the second, his confidence growing. But as he reached for it, a disembodied, synthesized voice echoed through the corridor. Maintenance anomaly detected. Verify clearance code. The administrator must have reported his datapad missing. Their cover was blown. The turret's light instantly snapped to red. An alarm blared, shrill and piercing. Doors slammed shut at both ends of the corridor, trapping them. Lyra screamed. The turret opened fire, bolts of plasma searing the air where Kyle had been a second before. He dove behind the massive conduit, the heat washing over his back. Red lights bathed the corridor. He was pinned. Lyra, how much longer? He yelled over the scream of the alarm and the thud of plasma impacts against his cover. I need 2 more minutes, she shouted back, her hands a blur of motion, refusing to be distracted. He didn't have 2 minutes. He could hear the heavy, mag-locked boots of the Praetorians approaching from behind the sealed door. He risked a glance. 4 turrets were active, their overlapping fields of fire turning the corridor into a death trap. He was out of clamps, out of tricks. Then he saw it. a coolant pipe running along the ceiling, its surface beaded with condensation. An old reclaimer's rule: where there's power, there's heat. Where there's heat, there's coolant. He aimed his pulse pistol at the pipe directly above the remaining turrets. The first shot was absorbed by the thick metal. The second ruptured it. A pressurized spray of cryogenic coolant rained down. The effect was instantaneous. The supercooled liquid flash froze the turret's delicate joints and targeting lenses. One seized up completely. Another shattered its own focusing crystal as it tried to fire through a layer of ice. The remaining two went haywire, firing wildly as their systems short-circuited. The plasma barrage stopped, but the reprieve was short-lived. The sealed door began to glow cherry red in the center as a Praetorian guard started cutting through with a breaching torch. "It's done!" Lyra yelled, slamming the access panel shut and scrambling back. "It's rigged to blow on my command. We have to go." "Now." Kale looked at the glowing door, then at the ventilation shaft on the far wall. "Up," he ordered, firing a grappling hook from his wrist launcher. It bit into the grate. He clipped Lyra onto the line first. "Go, I'm right behind you." The moment she was clear, the door exploded inward. 3 Praetorians stormed into the room, their silver armor impervious to the chaos. Kyle fired his last few shots, the bolts harmlessly dissipating against their shields, and hit the ascender, rocketing up into the shaft just as a volley of plasma fire vaporized the spot where he'd been standing. They scrambled through the vents, the sound of the explosion behind them a deep, guttural whump that shook the entire deck. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness as emergency power kicked in. The alarms stopped, replaced by a calm, female voice echoing through the ship. Critical power fluctuation detected. Central relay initiating system reboot. All core security protocols temporarily disengaged. 12 seconds. Kyle breathed as they dropped into the corridor outside the core chamber. The massive circular blast door was open, its quantum locks retracting into the frame. Inside, the core of the central relay pulsed with a soft blue light, a sphere of contained energy floating in a magnetic containment field. It was the heart of the purge system. 2 Praetorians stood guard inside, turning in surprise as Kale and Lyra charged in. There was no time for a firefight. Kyle tackled the first guard, driving his plasma cutter into a weak point at the neck seal. The guard convulsed and fell. Lyra, meanwhile, slid under the second guard's guard, jamming the stolen datapad into a port on the containment field's console and typing a frantic command. The Praetorian brought the butt of his rifle down, but Kyle was there, grabbing the weapon and wrestling with the powerful guard. "Lyra, now!" he roared. Lyra finished the command sequence. Override, initiate, cascade failure. She yanked the datapad free and ran. The blue light of the core flickered, turning a virulent red. A high-pitched whine began to build. "Kyle." The Praetorian threw Kale against the far wall, the impact knocking the wind out of him. The guard raised his rifle for the kill shot, but it was too late. The containment field collapsed. The core, its energy unstable, detonated. It wasn't a fiery explosion. It was an implosion of reality. A wave of silent, white energy washed through the room, disintegrating the Praetorian guard into nothingness. Kale felt a searing, tearing pain as the wave passed over him. And then darkness claimed him. He awoke to Lyra shaking him, her face streaked with soot and tears. "Kyle, wake up!" He groaned, his entire body screaming in protest. The core chamber was a wreck of twisted metal and scorched walls. The core was gone. They had done it. They had cut the heart out of the awakening protocol. As he staggered to his feet, a ship-wide broadcast crackled to life, overriding the emergency channels. It was the voice of the chief administrator himself, a man no one in the guts had ever seen. His voice cold, precise, and filled with a chilling lack of panic. To the secondary populations, the voice began, echoing in every corridor of the ship. A terrorist act has been committed against the structural integrity of this vessel. The perpetrators, deviants from the lower decks, have forced our hand. The compromise of Project Lineage is now absolute. As per Earth Directive 7 Contingency Awakening has failed, we are now invoking the final protocol. A new schematic appeared on a nearby, shattered monitor. It showed the spire, a section Kale had never seen, labeled Arc Separation System. The spire section of the Arcala will now detach from the primary vessel, the administrator announced calmly. The mids and gut sections will be jettisoned. May you find your own way in the dark. The lineage will continue. Earth be praised. Kyle and Lyra could only stare in horror. They hadn't won. They had only changed the method of their execution. The administrators weren't going to burn the slaughterhouse down. They were going to unhitch it and leave it to rot in the abyss. A deep, grinding shudder ran through the entire ship, the sound of giant, ancient locking clamps disengaging. They were being abandoned, cast off into the void in a dying metal tomb, left to face a slow, cold death in a ship that was never meant to survive on its own. The separation was not a clean break. It was a brutal amputation, a bone-deep groan, a sound of tortured metal on a scale Kyle could barely comprehend, shuddered through the ship's spine. The deck plates buckled under their feet, and the emergency lights strobed, casting the twisted corridor in a frantic, terrifying rhythm of light and shadow. Through a viewport, they saw at the spire, a pristine porcelain shard of a vessel, pulling away with a calm, deliberate grace. Its engines flared, and it slid into the endless night, leaving them behind. Then the Arcala began to die. The primary systems, all tethered to the spire's command and control, went into catastrophic failure. The steady hum of life support faltered, replaced by the panicked hiss of failing regulators. Gravity fluctuated wildly, a nauseating lurch that sent them slamming against the bulkhead, followed by a moment of terrifying weightlessness. The ship was no longer a vessel, it was a tomb, tumbling through the void. Panic was a contagion, spreading faster than any fire. Kyle and Lyra were swept up in a tide of screaming, desperate people pouring out of the mid-deck habs. The placid ignorance had shattered, replaced by raw, primal fear. The social order dissolved in minutes. The mids, who had for generations viewed the guts as a pit of subhuman squalor, now saw them as the cause of this apocalypse. Fights broke out, the clean corridors turning into bloody battlegrounds. This way. Kale yelled, grabbing Lyra's arm and pulling her against the current of chaos. He knew this ship's bones. While everyone else saw corridors and decks, he saw the spaces in between. He dragged her into a darkened hydrobay, kicked open a maintenance hatch, and pulled them into the relative quiet of a plumbing conduit. They huddled in the darkness, listening to the screams and the groaning protests of their dying world. The weight of what he had done crashed down on Kyle. He had traded a swift, targeted purge for a slow, agonizing extinction for millions. He had tried to save his sister and, in doing so, had condemned everyone. "This isn't your fault, Kyle," Lyra whispered, as if reading his thoughts. Her voice was steady, her fear tempered by a cold, hard anger that was becoming her new foundation. "You didn't build this prison. You didn't write the kill order. We fought back. That's all." Her words were a small, defiant light in his suffocating guilt. She was right. The blame lay with the ghost of Earth and the administrators who had followed its orders so blindly. They hadn't started this war, but they were the only ones left to finish it. "The glitches," Kyle said, his voice raw. "The node, it's our only chance." Getting back down to the guts was a descent into hell. The anarchy in the mids was a panic-driven riot. The anarchy in the guts was a grim, calculated war for resources. Gangs, once held in check by the wardens, had taken over entire sectors, hoarding food, water, and power cells. The wardens themselves had fractured. Some tried to maintain order, becoming brutal warlords in their own right, while others, leaderless and terrified, were hunted down by the very people they had oppressed. Kyle and Lyra moved like wraiths through this new, savage landscape, using the hidden paths Kyle knew so well. When they finally reached the entrance to the node, it was sealed, a heavy blast door barring the way. Kale sent a coded ping, a signal he'd learned from Corvus, into the access panel. For a long, tense moment, there was nothing. Then a single, green light flickered, and the door hissed open. The node was on a war footing. The chaotic, creative energy had been replaced by a focused, desperate intensity. Screens showed plummeting oxygen levels, failing heat regulators, and the ship's slow, uncontrolled tumble. Ilara stood before the main holographic display, her face grim, directing teams with curt, precise commands. She looked up as they entered, and the frustration in her eyes was palpable. "You're a fool, Kyle," she said, without preamble. "But you're a fool who managed to burn down the whole damn farm. I'm almost impressed." "They jettisoned us," Kyle said, the words tasting like ash. "The whole ship is dying." "I'm aware," she snapped, gesturing to the dire readouts. "Life support is cascading. We have maybe a week of breathable air before the recyclers fail completely. The ship is tumbling, which is putting catastrophic stress on the superstructure. We're a tin can in a hurricane, and it's only a matter of time before it tears itself apart." "Can we fix it?" Lyra asked, her voice cutting through the technical jargon. Ilara's hard gaze softened for a fraction of a second as she looked at Lyra. "Fix it? No. We're a parasite. Remember, we've only ever known how to bleed the host. The host just left. We don't have control of the primary systems, the reactor, navigation, life support. We don't even have the command codes." "The data core does," Kyle said, pulling the shard from his satchel. "It has everything. The ship's original schematics, the command protocols from before Project Lineage. It's all here." Corvus, who had been working frantically at a nearby console, his eyes wide with a scholar's terror, looked up. "He's right. The core isn't just a log, it's a key, an archive of the ship's entire operational history locked away under the Lineage protocol." Ilara stared at the core as if it were a holy relic. "You're telling me we have the keys to the kingdom. We have the keys to a graveyard," Kale corrected her. "But it's the only one we've got. Where can we use them? Where is the ship's actual command center? Corvus answered, his voice a hushed whisper. The bridge. It hasn't been used in 3 centuries. It was sealed after the Great Correction, which is what the administrators called the start of Project Lineage. It's a dead zone, even more so than Deck 87. No power, no life support. According to the old texts, it's guarded. Guarded by what? Ilara asked. Praetorians, Corvus said, a tremor in his voice. Not just guards, custodians. A small, elite cadre left behind, conditioned for a single purpose, to ensure no one ever reaches the bridge and learns the truth. They're fanatics. A new plan formed, born of utter desperation. It was no longer about sabotage or revolution. It was about reclamation. They had to take back control of their world. While Ilara's glitches worked to broadcast the truth from the data core across the entire ship, showing everyone the manifest. The Purge orders. The Administrator's final, damning message. Kale would lead a small team to the one place that could save them all. Their destination was the nose of the ship, a place as mythical and forbidden as the Spire had been. Their team was small, a motley crew of glitches and gut scrappers, armed with scavenged warden gear and a burning, nihilistic courage. Lyra refused to stay behind. She'd become an expert at slicing through the ship's decaying security systems, her skills now more valuable than any soldiers. The journey to the bridge was a journey through the ship's history. They passed through decks that were pristine, untouched for centuries, halls filled with a strange, expectant silence. They saw crew quarters with personal effects still neatly arranged, waiting for owners who had been culled 300 years ago. It was a museum of the lie they had all been living. They found the custodians guarding the final approach, a grand circular antechamber before the bridge. There were only 6 of them, standing as still as statues in their polished silver armor, their faces hidden behind masks of absolute authority. They didn't speak. They simply raised their plasma repeaters. The fight was brutal and short. The glitches were scrappers, not soldiers, but they fought with the ferocity of cornered animals. Kekel moved with a cold, precise rage, his reclaimer instincts perfectly suited for this battle of ambush and attrition in the decaying, labyrinthine corridors. He saw Lyra disable the chamber's automated defenses from a console, her face illuminated by the glow of the screen. A goddess of the machine. They lost 4 people, but they made it through. The blast door to the bridge was sealed, but not with power. It was a simple, formidable physical lock, a symbol of a forgotten age. As Kale cut through it with his plasma cutter, he felt like an archaeologist breaking into a pharaoh's tomb. The bridge was vast, dark, and silent, the air thick with the dust of ages. A massive view screen, now black and dead, dominated the front wall. Consoles and command chairs were arranged in tiers, all of them silent. It was a throne room without a king, a heart that had not beaten in centuries. "This is it," Corvus said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space as he and Ilara's tech team entered. The Arcala's soul. They had no time for awe. Kyle connected the data core to the master command console. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low hum, the consoles began to flicker to life, one by one, ghosts of old commands stirring in their sleep. A single, pure, female voice, the ship's original AI, spoke from the silence, its tone calm and inquisitive. Primary command authority recognized. "Welcome back, Captain. Systems have been offline for 307 years. Please state the nature of the emergency." Ilara let out a choked laugh, a sound of pure, incredulous relief. On the main screen, the starfield ignited, a dizzying, terrifying, beautiful sweep of galaxies. They were tumbling, just as she'd said, but now they could see it. "Reroute all auxiliary power to life support and artificial gravity," Kale ordered, his voice resonating with an authority he didn't know he possessed. "Acknowledged," the AI replied. A deep thrum vibrated through the deck as power was diverted. The nauseating lurching began to subside, replaced by a steady, solid gravity. A cheer erupted from the assembled glitches. It wasn't over. It was barely a beginning. The ship was crippled. Millions were on the verge of starvation, and a new society had to be forged from the ashes of a lie. But as Kale stood on the bridge, looking out at the endless night, he felt something he hadn't felt since he was a child, a flicker of genuine hope. He looked at Lyra, who stood beside him, her face reflecting the starlight on the view screen. The fade was gone, but the scars of the system that created it would remain forever. The lie was dead. The future was unwritten, a terrifying and exhilarating void. He had gone into the darkness, looking for a way to save his sister. He had emerged with the fate of a world in his hands. He was still a reclaimer, but now he had something new to salvage a future. He keyed the ship-wide comm. His voice, now the voice of the Arcala, echoed in every corridor, every hab unit, every dark corner of the guts and the mids. "This is Kale. The administrators are gone. Earth is a ghost. All there is us." He paused, looking at the faces of his crew, at his sister, at the star-dusted abyss ahead. "The journey is over. Now we begin to build. We are the Arcala now."